Even if I don't totally agree with the author on everything, I do think it's cool symbolism. However, he just comes across a bit too heavy-handed and cocky because this whole— Hello, and thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about Life of Pi by Jan Mattel, published in 2001, and I'm comparing it with the movie directed by Ang Lee, released in 2012. And I'm just gonna jump right into it. So this book and movie plot is very similar. We have some changes that we will get into, but the basic plot is the same. So we have Pi, who is a teenager living in India with his family, his brother, and his parents, and his dad runs a zoo. However, partway through the story, his dad and mom decide they want to move to Canada and they're going to sell the animals, and some of the animals are being sold to other countries. So they're going on a cargo ship to Canada, but they're bringing a lot of the animals with them so that they can sell them on the way. However, the ship sinks, and so Pi ends up on a lifeboat with an injured zebra, an orangutan, a hyena, and a tiger. And eventually the hyena kills the zebra and the orangutan, and then the tiger kills the hyena, which leaves Pi on a lifeboat with a tiger. And the tiger, his name is Richard Parker, and he's of course a ferocious beast. However, Pi knows that they have to just find a way to coexist, and so he kind of tames Richard Parker to some extent and tries to show himself as being the dominant one, which it kind of works at times. But he also builds this separate raft out of the life jackets so that Richard Parker can have the boat as his domain, his territory, and then Pi will hang out on this raft. And yeah, the two of them learn to survive together, and they are lost at sea for like over 200 days too. So it is a very long time. And eventually they like wash ashore on this like algae island, and it is inhabited by thousands of meerkats. And so when they land on this island, you know, there's fresh water and the algae to eat. And so Pi is just happily living here on this island, and he sleeps in the trees along with the meerkats, and Richard Parker will go to the boat to sleep. But for the most part, he like doesn't see the tiger when he's on this island very much. However, he ends up realizing that the reason the meerkats sleep in the trees and the reason Richard Parker goes back to the boat to sleep is because at night, like the water becomes toxic and the ground of the island becomes toxic, and it's like a carnivorous island. And he even finds a human teeth like wrapped up in leaves in the tree from someone else who had stayed on the island too long. The island ended up like eating them essentially. And he had been content on this island with no desire to leave. But once he realizes this, he's like, okay, we got to get off this island now. And so he goes back to the lifeboat and gets ready to head off, and he waits for Richard Parker to come back because he has grown attached to Richard Parker. So once the tiger is back on the boat, the two of them go out into the ocean yet again, and before long they end up washing up on the shores of Mexico. And once they are in Mexico, Richard Parker just runs off and leaves, and Pi is saved by the locals. But Pi is very upset though because Richard Parker just left, and after spending nearly a year with just Richard Parker and himself, he is sad that like their bond ended so unceremoniously and he didn't get to say goodbye to him and to thank him, you know. But while he is at the hospital, these two men who are like affiliated with the cargo ship come to his hospital room to ask him like, what happened? How did the ship sink? Like, give us all the details. And he tells him the story about all of the animals and the tiger and the island, and they are just like, that's ridiculous. That can't be true. Like, tell us the truth. And so then Pi tells them another story, and in this story he says that on the lifeboat it had been him, his mom, the cook from the ship, and a sailor from the ship, and it was the four of them. However, the cook is just like this horrible demented person, and he ends up killing the sailor and Pi's mom, and Pi ends up killing the cook, and then he is just alone on this lifeboat until washing ashore in Mexico. And so these are the two stories he gives them to choose between, and of course there's a lot of symbolism here we will get into, but first I want to talk about the changes from book to movie. So in the book we just hear more about his time growing up in India, and we hear a lot, like too much, about the animals at the zoo and their behaviors and things, which was just too much and unnecessary. But we also hear in both book and movie, when he was age 10, he decided he wanted to be part of 3 different religions: Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. And in the movie, his parents are just aware of this, and they tell him at the dinner table, like, you can't be all 3, you need to choose one. Whereas in the book, the way the parents find out is that they're in like some city center area, and the 3 men who have been teaching Pi from these different denominations see him, and they all walk up to him and they're like, wait a minute, like, what? Like, Pi, you're part of all of these religions? And the 3 men, as well as his parents, tell him like, you can't be all 3, like you need to choose just one. But Pi tells them that he wants to be part of all of the religions and that he loves God, and they can't argue with him loving God, and so they just kind of life, except that he wants to be all three religions. And the movie adds like this super brief romance, like quote unquote romance, between Pi and this dancer. And it is so brief and it serves no point. Like, it was a totally unnecessary addition that added nothing to the movie, and I don't know why it was even in there. The movie also has an added scene where when they get on the ship, we see them eating and they have like this altercation with the cook, who we clearly see is a very rude man. And then they have an interaction with a sailor who is very kind to them. And we later find out that this is the cook that was on the lifeboat with him, and the sailor they talked with is the sailor that had been on the lifeboat who died. And we don't get this mealtime scene in the book. And in the book, so not long before they get to the algae carnivorous island, shortly before that, Pi and the tiger had gone temporarily blind due to lack of nutrients. And while he is blind, he hears a voice talking to him, being like, "Is anybody there?" And he starts having a conversation with this person. And initially, Pi is thinking like, "Oh, I'm just going crazy. This is my imagination." And then he's thinking it's Richard Parker talking to him, also like in his imagination though. But then he realizes that he's not hallucinating or imagining it, and that it really is this French man who is also lost at sea, who is also blind. And this French man, he comes aboard Pi's lifeboat, but he doesn't know that Richard Parker is on the boat because he's blind. And so Richard Parker ends up killing the sailor. And initially when I read this part, I was like, this can't be real. Like, this whole thing has to be a hallucination because it's way too much of a coincidence and it's just so random and weird. However, like, he goes on a lot about the French man's body in the boat, like so much so that I was like, okay, clearly this did happen then. But ultimately we find out in the end that this didn't really happen. You know, same with like everything with the animals. None of that actually happened. It all is symbolic of something else. And this French sailor who was lost at sea also kind of represents the cook, because the cook had been French. And so yeah, this part of him coming across another person lost at sea who is also blind is not in the movie. And in the movie, he also doesn't go blind. And in general, the book was much more graphic than the movie. Like, the way the animals, like when the hyena and things are attacking, like, it was just far more graphic the way it was described. And his mom's death is also much more gruesome. And then also in the movie, he talks about how the cook killed the sailor and then the cook ended up eating the sailor. So we do hear that in the movie, but in the book, we just get more into that as well, which was very upsetting. And yeah, in general, I did not go into this book expecting it to be gruesome. And so those parts I did find kind of surprising. Whereas the movie, you know, tames it down a bit. But to get into the symbolism with the two stories Pi tells. So after he tells the second story, the one involving, you know, the cook and his mom, it seems pretty obvious that the second story is the true story. However, that is like the more traumatic story as well. And so Pi chose to create this other story involving the animals. And that is the one that he tells in much more detail than the true story. And after he tells us the true story, in both book and movie, the person listening is like, oh, so the zebra was the injured sailor, the orangutan was your mom, the hyena was the cook, and you were the tiger. And so all of the animals representing different people is like pretty obvious, and I feel like it doesn't need too much explaining. But I did want to get into Richard Parker because if you see him as being Pi, this makes sense because Pi had to tap into this like fierce animal side of himself in order to be able to survive. And he also says, because he kills the cook, and he says how the cook was like a violent man, and the cook's violence and, you know, animalistic side of him, that brought out the animalistic side in Pi, and he ended up killing the cook, which he feels bad about now because he took a human life. And so he's saying how the cook brought out that animal inside of him. But he also, you know, the cook could have ended up killing him if he hadn't killed the cook. So yeah, in order to survive, he kind of had to tap into this other side of his personality. And also in both book and movie, we see when he was in India, his father had him watch the tiger eat a goat because he's like, you need to learn not to mess around with these animals, so you need to know what they're capable of. And so it seems like that experience, you know, made an impact on him. And so when he's out, whether consciously or subconsciously, he is like, I need to become like that tiger, and I need to be ferocious and just do what I need to in order to survive. And he had also been a vegetarian, whereas when he's lost at sea, of course, he is now having to eat meat. And then once he washes ashore in Mexico, the tiger leaves, and it's because Pi no longer needs that side of himself, right? Because he just needed that in order to survive in these dire circumstances. But now that he's saved, that tiger side of him can now be on its way. But it also makes sense to see the tiger as representing God, because Pi is, you know, like I said, he's part of 3 different religions. He definitely has a lot of faith in God. And God is seen, like the tiger, as someone who is like very formidable and scary in a way, and yet at the same time, something beautiful and full of majesty. And in the book, initially when he's with the tiger, he's thinking of different options like, I can kill the tiger, I can do this, I can do that. But suddenly he realizes that the only option he has is to learn to coexist with the tiger. And he says, I had to tame him. It was at that moment that I realized this necessity. It was not a question of him or me, but of him and me. We were literally and figuratively in the same boat. We would live or we would die together. And so this is kind of like someone who is struggling with the idea of God and not wanting God in their lives. But eventually they learn that they just kind of need to accept God and find a way to have faith and to have God in their lives, right? So like that struggle that can sometimes happen between a person and their faith in God. And then when Richard Parker just walks away once they're on land, that could represent how like when we are struggling, we need, but also like sometimes feel God's presence stronger during those trials. Whereas once the struggle is over, maybe we kind of forget about God and feel like we don't need it anymore. And so Richard Parker just walking away is because that now Pi's greater struggle is over. Maybe he doesn't quote unquote need God in his life quite as much. Although he does say of Richard Parker that like, oh, even though he left, I'll always remember him and I will never forget him and he will always be with me, representing how God will always be with him. And then I do want to talk about the carnivorous algae island, because in the book, in the beginning part, when he is talking about religion, Pi is saying how he dislikes agnostics and how he prefers atheists over someone who like just can't decide, which is who he says an agnostic person is. And in this section I'm about to read, he is describing how a dying agnostic would react to seeing the light as they are about to die. And we read, the agnostic, if he stays true to his reasonable self, if he stays beholden to his dry, yeastless factuality, might try to explain the warm light bathing him by saying, possibly a failing oxygen of the brain, and to the very end, lack imagination and miss the better story. He also says later, we are also permitted to doubt, but we must move on. To choose doubt as a philosophy of life is akin to choosing immobility as a means of transportation. And so I therefore think that the island represents doubt. It represents not choosing, right? Having this middle ground. It's this middle ground that may feed your needs right now, but as they say in the movie, what it gave during the day, it took at night. And so ultimately you can stay in this middle ground area, but ultimately, it'll just end up taking from you and killing you. But it could also represent temptation and like the temptation of laziness, because the island fills his needs. And so he doesn't have any plan to leave. He doesn't aspire to anything more than just staying on this island because it's satisfying his needs right here, right now, in the moment. And that's what matters to him. And yet, when he finds out that it will eventually end up killing him, he realizes that he needs to use faith to leave the island and move on and try to find something better. And the meerkats, I think, they just represent people who choose to stay in this middle ground area full of doubt and potential laziness. But also the fact that when he's on the island, he is like never around Richard Parker. And yet when he decides to leave, he's like, I need to make sure that Richard Parker is with me. And that could represent how when you're in this area, this place of doubt or this place of laziness, you don't feel you need God. Also, like I said, this island provided a sense of security. And so maybe he thought like he was all good now. You don't need God anymore. You got things taken care of. And yet when he decides to choose faith and leave the island, he's like, I need to make sure the tiger is with me, representing the fact that he now wants God with him again. And so after Pi tells the two stories to these men, he then tells them, he's like, you know what? You don't know which of these stories is true ultimately. And in both stories, we get the same results where in both versions, we don't know why the ship sank, but it does. And in both versions, my family dies and I survive. And he's like, and so if it doesn't change the outcome, which story do you just like better? And they're like, well, we like the story with the animals better. And he says, and so it goes with God, meaning, the two stories can represent life where we all have struggles, we all end up dying. And so if that aspect isn't changed, which do we like better? Having those struggles and the stark reality of life without God, meaning without the animals, or do we prefer the story that makes the struggles more bearable, meaning the story with the animals, which also means living life with God? Because in life, we all struggle regardless, right? And yet, if we choose to have faith and believe in God, it can make our struggles more bearable and it can provide us more comfort and beauty in life, the way the tiger provided comfort and beauty in Pi's life. And in general, like, I don't have an issue with this message for the most part. And I do think the symbolism with the animals is cool, and even the island. Even if I don't totally agree with the author on everything, I do think it's cool symbolism. However, he just comes across a bit too heavy-handed and cocky, because this whole book starts with him being like, I have a story that's going to make you believe in God. That just really annoyed me that he is starting it out that way. And then the first third of the book, when Pi is talking about his religious beliefs and his thoughts on God and agnostics and atheists, it's really just the author going on and on about his own spiritual beliefs. And he does it in just kind of like a self-satisfied kind of way. And so even though I think the symbolism and the messages are cool, I don't like the tone that the book was written in for the most part. And also he starts out making you think that this is a true story. Like, he includes himself as a character, and he's like, oh, I was in India preparing for a book and it didn't go well, blah, blah, blah. I was struggling, and this is how this book came about because I was in India and some guy told me about this person named Pi Patel that I should go talk to. And so the fact that he just framed it as if it was a true story, I don't know, just that whole beginning part, I just really did not like. But to move on to book versus movie, and to just go on a bit more about my issues with this book, because on top of what I've already talked about, this book was just kind of tedious and I had a tough time getting through it. So when I started the book, I was not pulled in, but I was like, this part is tough to get through, but I'm hoping that once he's on the boat with the tiger, it'll get more interesting. And it did get interesting initially, but before long, it was boring again. And so I just really had to force myself to just sit and stick it out and finish this book. And also, I can admit, is just my personal opinion, because books that describe like, oh, here's how I fashioned an animal trap, or here's how I fashioned a fishing hook, or like survivalist stories like that, when they describe in detail how they created this or that, I don't find that interesting. Other people might find it more engaging, but I don't. So that is just personal preference. But he also over describes things like the meerkats, for example. The meerkats are on the carnivorous island, and he goes on and on describing to us what a meerkat looks like. Like, one, most of us know what a meerkat looks like. And two, even if we don't, we can figure out by context clues, the size of this animal. And he tells us details that don't even matter. Like, why are you telling us this? You're just going on and on about meerkats. Like, just get on with the story already. And I get Pi was raised in a zoo environment, so that could be part of his personality, where he finds it interesting to describe animals in detail, but it's just not interesting to read. So I don't care if it fits Pi's personality. The editor should have been like, we don't need this. You can take it out. And ultimately, like I said, while I don't dislike the message of the book, I just think it was too tedious and over-explained at times. And I also just didn't think his goal was executed very well due to the tone he sometimes had while writing this book. And I actually think the end story involving the cook and his mom, if we expanded upon that, that would have been an interesting story that I would have been engaged in, and it would have been suspenseful. But that wasn't Jan Mattel's purpose, right? He didn't want to write a shipwreck survival story. He wanted to write a story that would make someone believe in God. But yeah, all in all, the movie stays very close to the book, and we also have the benefit of the visuals, which is a big pro, and the movie doesn't drag on as much as the book does. And while I don't know if I'll ever watch this movie again, I know without a doubt I will never read the book again, so I'm going to say that the movie wins. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments, what you thought of this book and movie. What do you think of the symbolism? Did you like it? Did you not? And do you agree with my complaints as to Jan Mattel's writing? About him just kind of over describing things in a way that was boring. I did read a lot of people say that the beginning part of this book was very tedious, but then some people liked the next 75%, but then others don't. So anyway, let me know what you think of this book. Let me know what you think of the movie. It definitely is the better one of the two. If you like the book, I think you will like the movie. If you like the movie, I would say to skip the book. It's not necessary to read it because the movie is so faithful while not being as boring as the book was. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you have not already. Let me know your thoughts on the symbolism and everything, and if you agree with my interpretation or not. I want to hear everybody's opinions and everybody's views and perspectives. So let's talk about it down in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye.